Welcome to Obsession Engineering and the next episode in my Honda VTR 1000 SP1, technically an SPY because we're geeks, light restoration and upgrade. The premise of this project is to keep the bike looking standard but riding better. And we did the forks in the last episode. In this episode I'm going to be doing brakes. The brakes are not bad at all, but they're not brilliant, and of course that means they can be better. So what we're going to be doing in this episode is cleaning the brake calipers, fitting braided brake hoses and bleeding everything up with new fluid. So stay tuned for exciting workshop action. Ish. So these are the front brake calipers on my SP1. They're not currently attached to the bike other than by the brake line because I've just done the fork service. So they're actually in reasonably good condition, but when I ride the bike they're lacking a little bit of power. And these rubber brake hoses are now over 20 years old. So it's time to upgrade the brake hoses, give the calipers a very, very good thorough cleaning, and we're going to put some new pads in. And then, hopefully it'll stop considerably better. The very first thing I'm actually going to do though is take the cap off the reservoir and drain most of the fluid out of here. I'm just going to get some rag in it and soak the fluid out of it so that when I undo the calipers we don't have too much fluid trying to escape over the bench and over the bike. I've just refitted the caliper loose because it's easier to undo the next couple of bits. I've cracked off the bolts that hold the pads in, the pad pins, and I need to undo the banjo bolt. So I'm just going to put a little bit of cloth underneath there to catch any escaping brake fluid. It will stay eventually. And then I'll just get my spanner on the banjo bolt and... right, that was pretty tight, but you didn't want your brakes leaking, did you? So, undo the banjo bolt, take the caliper back off. The next bit on the list is to actually clean the brake calipers. Normally I would do this with them attached to the bike, but being as I'm actually going to be changing the brake lines, I had to disconnect them at some point anyway. So we will start by removing the pads. So undo the pins that hold the pads in. Obviously the arrangement of pad pins and retainers and stuff is different per bike. So pad pins removed. The plate that basically spring loads everything and stops the pads rattling has got a little arrow on it, and that points obviously in the direction the discs are going through the wheel. It even says up on the Honda one, so I'll put that over there and then I can take the pads out and I'm going to arrange them inside and outside like this so that I know when I put it back together which way round the pads are going to go. Now I'm actually going to fit new pads, but if you were doing this as a general maintenance thing, this way, if they're arranged correctly, when you put them back in, they don't have to bed back into the disc because they're already in the right orientation. For the next step, I'm going to be using a toothbrush and some slightly diluted Moto Wash, basically a bike detergent, a bike cleaner, and I'm just going to spray that into the caliper, a fairly liberal dosing of it, anywhere that's dirty. And then I'm going to get my screwdriver and I'm going to scrub the calipers. I'm mostly interested in cleaning the pistons because obviously they're the bits that are doing the business. They're the bits doing the stopping. So I'm going to get in everywhere I can with my toothbrush, give everything a nice thorough cleaning. What you can do, of course, is just keep moving your toothbrush around in the top of the caliper, in the bottom, and trying to get all the way around the piston. Or you can cheat and buy a set of piston pliers. So basically these just slot into the caliper there, into the piston, and I can actually turn the piston round and it seals, and it means I can get to each section of the piston and make sure it's all nice and clean. So these calipers have come up clean relatively easily because the bike's been quite well maintained in the past. Obviously if you have sticking pistons, or if your calipers just haven't been cleaned very often or used it a lot in bad weather, it is going to take longer to scrub. I used to use brake cleaner or GT85 to clean the pistons and bits, but sometimes the chemicals in these can affect the seals inside the calipers, and so soapy water is the best thing to use ideally, but not very liquid because it's full of salt. So a sort of proper bike cleaner, a toothbrush, bit of scrubbing, and you're going to get a reasonably clean caliper. The next thing I'm going to do is just rinse them off with some clean water and then give them a blowdown with an airline to dry everything off. So at this point it's a good idea to pump the pistons out or pull them out a little bit, and then you can put a little bit of lubrication on them. The only thing you should really be using to lubricate pistons is red rubber grease. And on a track bike I wouldn't really bother doing it, but if it's a road bike, especially if you're going to use it in bad weather quite a lot, little smear of red rubber grease and then push the pistons back in. Because this bike isn't going to see a lot of bad weather, I'm actually just going to put mine back together dry. So just nice and slowly, just push the pistons one at a time back into the caliper. Obviously, if they're still attached to the bike, the pressure in here, instead of pushing into the mass cylinder, might push the next piston out. So you've got to be very careful when you're pushing the pistons in that you don't push the next piston back out. If your pistons don't move relatively easily by hand, the chances are you need to take the pistons out and check the seals and probably clean underneath the seal tracks. There is another video that I have on taking the pistons out and actually replacing the seals. I'll put a link in the corner. So as we can see there, all the pistons are back sort of flush with the caliper. So the next thing to do is give it one last little wipe round, and then we'll put some new pads in. So now I've got my caliper clean, I've cleaned the sort of anti-rattle plate, and I've given the pad pins a little bit of a wipe, and I've put a tiny bit of copper slip on the threads because you don't want those seizing up. I'm going to be fitting some EBC EPFA pads. Now these are a fast road track day pad, and because they're a metal sintered pad, they've got quite a lot of initial bite, a bit like a normal road pad. If you go for a carbon or organic based pad, they tend to have less initial bite. The outright power is generally fairly similar, but I like quite a sharp brake lever, so I'm going with quite a heavily sintered pad. So this stage is relatively simple. Slide the pads into the caliper, take your anti-rattle plate and just drop that in there. I will admit on race bikes sometimes I don't actually fit the anti-rattle plate. It's not particularly essential, and then you have to sort of push the springy bit of the anti-rattle plate down, and then with your Allen key just screw the pad pin in, and same thing at the other end. So the pad pin arrangement, this bike has 2 pad pins. A lot of stuff has 1 pad pin, and quite a lot of the newer Brembo calipers don't have a pad pin at all, and they just use the sort of anti-rattle spring plate to actually load the calipers, the pads up in the caliper, and that retains them. Right, give them a good nip. It's not a bad idea to torque them up. You don't want them falling out, and if you over tighten them, it's quite possible to crack the caliper. So I shall get a torque wrench on them in a minute, but for now they're ready to go back on the fork leg. I now have both of my calipers clean and refitted with new pads fitted, and the next thing to do is remove the brake lines. I've already undone the bolts that sort of attach the brake lines to the yoke and bits, and so the next thing to do is crack off the bolt, the banjo, at the master cylinder. So I've put a bit of rag around there to keep the area nice and clean. We'll just take this one off and put it somewhere out of the way. The bin is a good option. Alright, so with the old brake lines removed, the new ones are dangling in place. I've already fitted the banjo at the top. It's very much a two-handed job, so I did that when I wasn't holding a camera. And the general routing is basically going to be past this mounting point here. I am actually going to put an electrical P-clip here because that will hold the brake lines nicely in place. They have got little rubber collars on them to go in the mudguard mounting points, and then this end just needs to bolt to the caliper. I am using Hell brake lines. I've been using them for years. The quality is excellent, and I'm using black ones because as much as the fancy colours are nice, on this bike I want them to remain almost unseen. So that is my top quality Hell brake lines fitted. I've got P-clips on here to basically hold them in the same place the standard brake lines would have been held, so that when you put it in lock nothing catches on the brake lines. So that's all tickety-boo, and they're routed down here, so when the mudguard is refitted they will clip back into the mudguard with the little rubber grommet in place. Because this Honda is on an axial master cylinder, not a radial, there isn't a bleed point on the master cylinder, but the top of the master cylinder there could easily actually catch a little bit of air. So I've not got these banjos particularly tight yet, and once I start getting a little bit of fluid transfer, what I will do is just crack them open and let some of the air just bleed out of here first, and that should make the rest of the bleeding a little bit easier, because it's going to be really easy to get the air trapped up there. So the next thing we need to do is put some fluid in. I'm going to be using Motul .4 brake fluid. This bike doesn't need fancy sort of really high temperature race spec stuff, and then you either have the choice of having literally a bottle with a piece of pipe attached to the bleed nipple, or, because I'm fancy and I've invested a little bit, I have a vacuum fed one that connects to my airline, and so that when I fire the vacuum it basically sucks the fluid through from the master cylinder or from the reservoir all the way through to the caliper, and that should make bleeding them up considerably quicker. Being as this is actually a how-to video, I am actually going to show you how to do brake bleeding the old-fashioned way first. So, take your top quality Motul brake fluid that's going to be running through your top quality hell hoses, and put a bit in the reservoir, and the next stage is pretty simple. I'm going to set the lever to number 1, so I've got the most travel available. I'm literally going to pull the brake lever in and then open the bleed nipple. Give it a second, close the bleed nipple, release the pressure in the brake line. And then the idea is that as we pump the brake, that pushes fluid from the master cylinder down into the lines, and then when we open the bleed nipple, we'll crack that open, it lets the air out of the caliper. And so bit by bit, we'll keep pushing the air out of the system. So pull, open, close, release. If you open the, if you release the master cylinder with the caliper open, there's a fairly good chance it's just going to pull the air you've just pushed out of the caliper back into the caliper, and basically just move the air, the fluid forwards and backwards up and down the lines, and you're not going to get very far. So squeeze, open, close, release. Squeeze, open, close, release. Squeeze, open, close, release. And you're going to be doing this for a while. And so to cheat, I'm going to put my vacuum feed on it. So this is going to get a bit noisier. I'm going to open my bleed nipple up. I'm going to basically pull on this, which creates the vacuum, and then bit by bit I'm just going to keep pumping the lever, and then it should pull all the air out of the system and follow it with the fluid. So it should be a bit faster. So that has pulled a reservoir's worth of brake fluids through already. But if I do a couple of pumps manually, I can still see there is a lot of air still in the system. So this is going to take a while, and what I'll probably do is swap between this caliper and the other one, just so we're trying to pull all the air out of the system relatively equally. So I'm beginning to get a reasonable lever. I've sort of pumped through both calipers a couple of times. I've given them a good suck, and we've got a reasonable lever, but it's not mega yet. So what I'm going to do next is just crack the top banjo off a little bit, so that if there is a tiny bit of air trapped in here, we can hopefully get it out. So bit of rag up there, get the spanner on the job, and only put a tiny little bit of pressure on the master cylinder. And I could see a couple of little air bubbles coming out of there. And we just need to do a little bit just to get any tiny little air bubbles out, and then we can give that a correct tightening up. Remove my piece of rag, we'll have another little clean up there. What I tend to do at the end when I'm getting fairly close is actually do it without the vacuum, and that way I can get a really nice feel for how good the lever's getting, and then you know when you're about finished. There's one little trick. I always used to use a normal piece of tube, but then I started using clear tube, and then you can see any air bubbles that come out. Except if the tube has anything but a perfect seal, or even sometimes down the edge of the thread of the bleed nipple, you'll get a little bit of air. So sometimes you can have actually finished bleeding and you've got all the air out, but it still looks like you're getting air in because it's coming up the end of the tube. So just be a little bit aware of that. If it feels really good, it's probably finished. So I'm happy now that I have a nice firm brake lever, which means I've got all the air out of it. So that is happy days. The next thing to do is a little bit of cleaning up. So I like to screw up a little piece of rag and just poke it delicately into the hole, and that'll sort of absorb any brake fluid that's left in the hole. So a little bit on the end of there, we're happy that that's not got too much in it. We'll have a wipe round the bleed nipple as well, and then we can put the dust cover back on it. And that is it for sorting the brakes on my SP1. I've topped the reservoir up, and while you're bleeding it, always keep an eye on that, because if it runs out, you're going to have to start bleeding it all over again. So the top's back on, everything's clean, everything's tight. Happy days. I hope it has been some use to you, even if it's just been for curing your insomnia. So thank you, and join me again next time. We'll be tinkering around some more with the SP1.